Mason had always prided himself on building a life of stability and trust. He and Amelia had been married for 4 years, a marriage founded on shared ambitions and the promise of a bright future. Their life was busy but fulfilling. Mason worked as an IT consultant, and Amelia was climbing the corporate ladder in marketing. They were partners in every sense of the word, pouring energy into their careers to ensure a secure future for the children they hoped to have one day. But lately something about Amelia seemed different. At first she spent an unusual amount of time on her phone. Her fingers tapped furiously on the screen whenever Mason asked who she was texting. Amelia would laugh it off, saying it was work. They were both putting a lot of energy into their careers to make sure they could provide for their future kids. Lately though something about Amelia seemed different. It was subtle at first. She was spending a lot more time on her phone. When Mason asked who she was texting, she just laughed it off, saying it was work. She said she was up for a big promotion, and that the long hours and constant communication with her colleagues were just part of the process. Mason wasn't totally convinced though. It wasn't just the phone. Amelia had started staying late at the office more often, arriving home hours after him. He wanted to believe her, really he did, but there were little signs that made him think twice, like the way she would brush off his concerns with a calm, rehearsed manner or the distant look she gave him when he asked about her day. Amelia's day reached its breaking point one Thursday evening. She walked through the front door, her cheeks slightly flushed and her hair disheveled in a way that wasn't typical of her usual meticulousness. Mason noticed it immediately. There was a faint but distinct scent of cologne on her, a scent he didn't recognize. "What's that smell?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. She froze for a moment, her eyes darting toward the floor. Then she laughed a bit too loudly, a bit too forced. "Oh, I stopped at a perfume store after work. I was picking out a new scent for you." Surprise, Mason's gut told him. Twisted her explanation was. She delivered it with the practiced precision of someone who had rehearsed it, yet the sharpness in her tone suggested a defensive edge. He didn't want to press further, but the unease was impossible to shake. "Why didn't you mention it earlier?" he probed gently. Amelia's expression hardened. "Are you accusing me of?" "Mason, I've been putting in extra hours to help us, and you're giving me a hard time because I wanted to do something nice for you." The atmosphere between them became tense as her voice grew louder. Mason decided to drop the subject, but the damage was done later that night as Amelia showered. Mason sat on the edge of the bed. She was sitting on their bed, staring at the blank screen of the TV. Her answer may have been brilliant, but it didn't feel like the truth. That scent, that link, lingered in his thoughts like a shadow. Something wasn't adding up. The next morning, Mason sat at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched plate of scrambled eggs. Across from him, Amelia was scrolling on her phone with a cup of coffee in her free hand. The warm light of the rising sun streamed through the window, but the atmosphere was far from peaceful. The tension that had simmered the night before now felt unbearable. Mason couldn't ignore it any longer. He said as Amelia he began, his tone steady but gentle. "Can we talk for a minute?" She looked up from her phone, startled. "Sure, what's up?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Is everything okay with us? I mean, in our relationship?" Her expression flickered just for a moment, but it was enough for him to notice. It was just a moment, but Mason noticed that things seemed a little off. He pressed on, leaning forward slightly. "Is there something you're not happy with, or if I've done something to make you feel distant? I want to know. And if there's someone else, or if this marriage is becoming a burden to you, then we should discuss it openly." Her laugh came too quickly, sharp and nervous. "Oh Mason, don't be ridiculous." "Is it ridiculous?" he asked, his voice firmer. "I'm just trying to understand. You've been distant lately." He was cut off as she set her coffee cup down with a clatter. "Mason, you know what's wrong. I'm just trying to understand. You've been distant lately." "Yes, I've been busy with work. You're putting too much pressure on me and making me feel guilty." You probably don't like that I'm constantly busy with work, but guess what? That's life. I have a lot on my plate. I've got a lot on my plate at the moment, and I need some space, Mason thought. He wasn't expecting this level of deflection. Amelia, I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. I just want to know if there's something I can do to help. Mason was starting to feel like he wasn't helping. He was asking too many questions and making too many assumptions. He didn't even want to hear about it anymore. Her words stung, and the finality in her tone was like a wall slamming down between them. Mason tried a few more times to probe gently, asking if there was anything he could have done more to make things easier for her, but each time, Amelia skillfully deflected her responses, laced with frustration and just enough logic to make him doubt himself. By the time breakfast was over, Mason felt more uncertain than ever. He watched as Amelia grabbed her bag and headed out the door, goodbye I kiss, feeling perfunctory, almost like an afterthought. Over the next few days, things only got worse. Amelia became more secretive, guarding her phone like a hawk and taking calls out of earshot. She'd lock herself in the bedroom or head outside to speak in hushed tones, claiming it was work. Whenever Mason asked, she also seemed to go out of her way to avoid being alone with him. She filled her schedule with errands and late nights at the office. When she was home, she was either too tired to talk or glued to her phone, scrolling endlessly. Mason felt like a stranger in his own marriage. His attempts to bridge the gap met with thin smiles and vague reassurances. Finally, one evening, as he sat alone in the living room, the weight of it all pressed down on him. He couldn't keep playing this. Mason couldn't keep up the pretense any longer. It was clear that things weren't fine. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and staring into the darkness outside the window. He'd had enough. If Amelia wasn't willing to be honest with him, he'd have to find the truth himself. Watch this space to find out what happens next. Please subscribe to the channel. Mason's opportunity came one quiet evening. Amelia was engrossed in one of her favorite TV dramas, lounging on the couch with her phone in hand. Scrolling absent, Mason sat nearby, pretending to read a book, but his eyes occasionally flicked toward her. He was waiting for the moment when she would inevitably leave her phone unattended. It didn't take long. "I'll be right back," she said, setting her phone on the coffee table as she got up to go to the bathroom. Mason's heart raced as he glanced at the device. He had been watching her closely for days, memorizing the way she moved and the way she looked. She tapped her passcode quickly, taking a deep breath to steady herself. He grabbed the phone and entered the code. The screen unlocked, and Mason began navigating through her apps with practiced ease. He checked her messages first, but there was nothing. Not a single text. His brow furrowed as he opened her email app, and then her social media accounts again. There was nothing. Not a single conversation notification or interaction. It was as if Amelia only used her phone for the most basic functions. Then it hit him. She was deleting everything. Mason sat back, stunned. Amelia wasn't just being secretive. She was going to great lengths to cover her tracks. There weren't even work emails or messages, which she had previously claimed were the reason for her constant texting. Hearing the bathroom door creak open, Mason quickly placed the phone back on the table and resumed. His heart was racing as Amelia returned, seemingly unaware of his brief intrusion. The next day at work, Mason decided he needed expert advice. Jack, a junior technician on his team, was known for his knack for digital forensics. Mason approached him during their lunch break, framing the situation as a hypothetical. "Jack, let's say someone deletes everything off their phone. Texts, emails, everything. Is it possible to recover that data?" Mason asked Jack if it was possible to recover that data. Jack raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "It depends on the phone and how thorough they are, but yes, it's possible to recover data even if it's deleted, with the right equipment." "Why recover it when you can just capture it before it's gone?" Mason tilted his head. "What do you mean you can set up a virtual copy of the phone?" Jack explained. "It basically mirrors the device, including every message. Email or notifications get synced in real time. Even if the person deletes something, it's already backed up on the virtual copy. Mason leaned in, lowering his voice. You could set this up, hypothetically speaking, of course. Jack smirked. Hypothetically, sure, but you'd need access to the phone for a few minutes to install the necessary software. Why do you suspect someone of hiding something? Mason hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, something like that. Jack leaned back, thinking. Okay, here's what we do. If you can distract the person long enough, I can connect their phone to my tablet and set up the virtual copy. It'll take a few minutes tops. Mason felt a flicker of hope for the first time in days. Jack, I'll owe you one for this. That evening, Mason invited Jack over, saying he needed help with a work project. Mason greeted Jack at the door. She was at the door with an easy smile. Hey honey, this is Jack, my colleague. We thought it would be nice to brainstorm a project outside of work just for a bit. I hope you don't mind. Amelia gave Jack a polite nod. Of course not, she said, slipping off her shoes. I'll be in the kitchen, long day, and I could use a glass of wine. Mason and Jack exchanged a quick glance as she disappeared into the kitchen. Phase 1 is done. Where's her purse? Jack whispered. Mason pointed to the hall table. She'll be back any second. How do we do this without her noticing? Jack smirked. Be creative. Jack leaned in. Remember, keep her busy for at least 5 or 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Mason whispered back, incredulous. Jack shrugged with a mischievous grin. What can I say? Genius takes time. Mason slipped into the room. He went into the hallway and grabbed her purse. He opened it as quietly as he could and found her phone nestled inside. He took it out and passed it to Jack, who was waiting just around the corner. Go, Mason whispered, shaking his head. Jack went toward the room like they were part of some covert spy operation. He gave Mason a thumbs up as Amelia opened the fridge to get the wine bottle. Mason went into the room. The kitchen was filled with a happy, forced casualness. Hey, you know what I've been thinking about lately? Amelia gave him a puzzled look. What's on your mind right now? She said. That's what I've been thinking, Mason replied, nodding emphatically. Absolutely, he added. Organization is key. You've inspired me with how neat you always keep your purse, Amelia said, suddenly setting her wine glass down. I thought my purse could do with a similar makeover. Mason's heart skipped a beat. Oh, don't worry about it, he said, trying to sound casual. You deserve a break. What could be so urgent? Work stuff, I suppose. Forget it for a while and relax. Ignore him, Amelia thought, turning towards the hall. Mason grabbed the wine bottle and fumbled with it dramatically. Whoa, hold on, he exclaimed, pretending to lose his grip. Amelia turned back just in time to see catch the bottle at the last second, with some wine sloshing onto the counter. Careful, she said, hurrying back to grab a towel. Yeah, my bad, Mason said, sheepishly wiping at the spill, he said, wiping at the spill. See, this is why I'm not allowed to handle fine beverages. Hey, can you teach me that thing you do, where you swirl the wine to let it breathe? It's so fancy. Amelia stared at him, exasperated. Mason, it's not that hard. Show me, please. He handed her the wine glass, managing to block her path toward the hall again. There, happy very, she said, demonstrating the swirling motion. Mason said, grinning. Now, can you do that thing where you smell it and say something poetic like hints of oak and despair? Amelia laughed despite herself, shaking her head. You're ridiculous. Meanwhile, in the spare room, Jack was working furiously. He had connected Amelia's phone to his tablet and was watching the progress bar inch forward as the virtual copy began syncing. Come on, he muttered under his breath in the kitchen. Mason was holding Amelia down as best he could as he raised the glass to his lips. Amelia's patience was wearing thin, he thought. She was okay with the theatrics, but he could tell she was getting antsy. He was about to say something when she suddenly moved and he accidentally bumped into her, causing a splash of wine to land on her sleeve. "Oh, sorry," he said, grabbing a napkin and dabbing at the stain. "No, it's my fault," she replied, staring at the stain, a napkin and dabbing at her arm. He said, "I'm such a klutz today. Here, let me fix it." "Just stop," she said. "Oh, don't worry about it," and went to the bathroom to clean up in the spare room. Jack wiped his brow as the progress bar finally reached 100%. He disconnected the phone and hurried to return it to Mason. When Amelia emerged from the bathroom wearing a clean sweatshirt and an irritated expression, Mason had just managed to slip her phone back in. "Her handbag felt better," he said, with an innocent smile. "Better than you, apparently," she replied, shaking her head. "You're acting so weird tonight," she told him. "Me weird?" Mason laughed nervously. "No, just keeping things interesting," she replied. Amelia rolled her eyes and headed straight for her handbag. Mason's pulse quickened as she reached inside. "Hey, how about we order Thai food?" he blurted out. "I'm starving," he added. "That's why I'm acting a little strange, you know. Low blood sugar turns me into a total weirdo." He grinned, trying to diffuse her suspicion with humor. Amelia paused, looking up. "Thai food," she said. "Yep," he replied. "Pad Thai, green curry, those little spring rolls, the works." Mason rattled off, edging closer to her order for 3. "Jack's still here after all," he said. At that moment, Jack reappeared from the spare room, holding his tablet with a business, Mason said, his tone professional. "I've jotted down some ideas for the project. I think these could work well." I nodded with exaggerated seriousness as if I were deeply contemplating Jack's ideas. He said, taking the tablet and glancing at the blank screen before handing it back. "Should I?" Amelia asked, looking between them. "Should we order food for 3? Jack smiled politely, shaking his head. "I really should get going. I wouldn't want to intrude." Mason nudged Jack in the side with a playful grin. "You're staying." Amelia raised an eyebrow but shrugged. "All right, dinner for 3 it is." The 3 of them an hour later, they were still at the dining table, enjoying their Thai feast. Mason was trying to keep the conversation light and funny, cracking jokes about their project while Jack played along with commendable ease. "So," Jack said, spearing a piece of chicken with his fork. "What kind of work do you usually do?" "Mason's work mostly involves brainstorming and troubleshooting," Jack replied with a smile, "and sometimes he's invited to awkward dinner parties." Mason laughed and said, "Hey, I'm just trying to expand your horizons," Jack replied. "Maybe one day you'll work in hospitality." The table laughed and the tension in the room eased for a while. A couple of hours later, Jack stood at the door, pulling on his jacket. "Thanks for the food," he said, smiling at Amelia. "Good luck with your drawer project," Mason replied, clapping Jack on the shoulder as he left. Mason let out a deep breath. The evening had been chaotic, but it ended on a high note. Now that Jack's operation has been a success, Mason's only goal is to uncover what Amelia has been hiding for a month. Mason has watched his suspicions turn into undeniable truths. The virtual copy Jack set up provides a steady stream of data from Amelia's phone to Mason's tablet, including every deleted text and call log, and every photo slowly painted a picture. Mason had really hoped to avoid the messages, but there they were. The ones with Bruce, who turned out to be a colleague from another department, were frequent and unmistakably intimate. The light flirting, the inside jokes, the late-night texts that ended with emojis. It was all a bit too personal for comfort. It all told the same story. Mason's heart was aching and he didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was irrefutable. Amelia wasn't just distant, she was building a secret life with another man. When he finally decided to confront her, Mason knew it had to be memorable, not just for the shock factor, but Mason had to wait a month for Amelia to realize what she'd done. In the meantime, he had to put up with her phone drip-feeding him messages, call logs, and other clues. The more he saw, the worse it got. She was in touch with Bruce a lot. One former client stood out immediately. Their exchanges were personal, intimate, and filled with subtle undertones that Mason couldn't ignore. Bruce was older, charismatic, and based on the tone of their messages, enamored with Amelia. One evening, Mason approached Amelia as she worked on her laptop at the dining table. "I thought we should have a date night. How about Thursday?" Amelia looked up, hesitating for just a fraction of a second. "Thursday? I'd love to, but I have a business meeting that evening. It's with an old client from work. Maybe another time." He smiled faintly, feeling a little down but determined. He'd get her out again soon. What Amelia didn't know was that Mason already knew about her plans. When Thursday evening came, Mason dressed sharply and arrived at the restaurant well ahead of time. He chose a discreet table near the back where he could see the entrance without being noticed. Mason noticed right away that he didn't have to wait long. Amelia arrived looking stunning in a sleek black dress that hugged her figure. Mason watched as she scanned the room, looking for someone. When a hostess approached, Amelia gave Bruce's name and was escorted to a table by the window. Mason let her settle in before making his move. Mason's move, she sat at the table, glancing nervously at the door and checking her phone every few moments. Mason could see her fidgeting, her fingers drumming lightly on the tablecloth, as she waited for Bruce to arrive. Finally, Mason stood, smoothing the front of his blazer. He walked across the room with deliberate ease and slid into the seat across from her. Amelia's head jerked up in shock. Her eyes widened and she nearly knocked over her glass of water in her surprise. "Mason," she blurted, her voice tinged with alarm. "What are you doing here?" Amelia's shock quickly shifted to irritation, her cheeks flushed. "What is this? How did you even know I'd be here?" Mason smiled, his expression laced with sarcasm. "I came on a date with you," he said, leaning back casually in his chair. "You know, instead of your lover." Her jaw clenched, her knuckles tightening on the edge of the table. "You're following me. You're acting crazy. I told you I had a business." Mason tilted his head slightly and spoke in a calm, almost maddening tone. "Amelia, calm down, don't be nervous. Tell me," he leaned in just a little, lowering his voice. "Is Bruce really better than me?" Amelia's face went pale, her lips parting in disbelief. "How did you know about Bruce?" she whispered. Mason didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up his glass of water and swirled it around, looking at her the whole time. Then he raised his hand to call over a waiter. "I'll have the steak medium rare," he said, glancing at the menu. "At the menu and a glass of your best red," the waiter nodded and left. Mason relaxed back into his chair as if nothing unusual were happening. Amelia stared at him, her mind racing. "Your questions are weird," she said finally, her voice sharp with defiance. "I'm waiting for Bruce. Bruce is my old. The client in this meeting might look informal, but I might be able to convince him to use the company's services. This is a business meeting, Mason, and when Bruce gets here, he'll confirm everything." Mason laughed softly, shaking his head. "Darling," he said, his voice dripping with irony. "Bruce isn't coming." Her breathing became erratic, and a hint of panic appeared on her face. "What are you talking about? I don't understand what's going on at all, this is surreal." Mason leaned forward, his smile fading as he met her gaze with cold intensity. "No, Amelia. What's surreal is watching my wife lie to my face for the first." Amelia looked away, her confidence faltering. Mason saw her defenses crumble bit by bit. He braced himself for what would come next. "Why Amelia?" he asked softly, his voice full of hurt. "Why Bruce? Why us?" Amelia didn't answer right away. Her eyes fixed on the tablecloth as though it held the answer. Amelia's frustration came out as she leaned across Ross and spoke up. "Mason, you're talking some nonsense and trying to make me look like an idiot. Where's Bruce hanging around? He'll prove me right when he gets here." Mason shook his head and kept his cool, but Amelia was unyielding. "I'll say it again, Bruce is not coming. She let out a sharp laugh, the nervous edge unmistakable. What the hell? How do you know? Are you a seer now? I don't understand you at all. Mason, maybe you've gone crazy. Mason raised an eyebrow. His tone was steady as he replied. Did you? I know that Bruce is married and has 3 children. I paused deliberately, as I just found out a little about him. The color drained from Amelia's face. She snapped, her voice defensive. Well, even if that's true, why the hell are you playing detective? You're the crazy one here, not me. Mason let out a sigh. He was still as calm as could be. Bruce wasn't coming because he was busy with his wife. She'd apparently found out about your affair. Amelia's mouth opened but no words came out. Her hands curled into fists, trembling slightly as the weight of Mason's words began to sink in. He leaned forward. Amelia, I'm not a detective, but I've learned a lot over the past month. Did you really think that deleting everything on your phone would make me blind to what you're doing? You can't keep fooling me. She stared at him, her mind racing. His words, his calm demeanor, everything about him. Now she felt certain of what she was saying. You're bluffing, she said finally, her voice cracking. You're just trying to mess with my head. At that moment the waiter returned with Mason's steak, placing the plate in front of him. Mason thanked him with a nod and picked up his knife. Amelia, he said calmly, his attention on slicing a perfect piece of meat. I'm not bluffing, I know everything, and I made sure Bruce wouldn't interfere tonight. He has enough of his own problems to deal with now. Her jaw tightened. Her hand flew into her bag and she pulled out her phone. She unlocked it with shaking fingers and dialed Bruce's number. She held the phone to her ear, her eyes narrowing at Mason, but then a robotic voice said, "The number you are trying to reach is currently disconnected. Please try again, later." Amelia's breath caught, and her fingers tightened around the phone as she pulled it away from her ear. She stared at the screen, the words on the display confirming what Mason had just said. She looked back at him, her facade of confidence crumbling. Mason set his knife down, meeting her gaze. He looked at her with a steady gaze, a hint of quiet resolve in his eyes. I still think I'm bluffing, he said, his voice soft but with an unmistakable authority. Amelia swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she placed the phone on the table for the first time that evening. She was struck speechless. She realized that Mason wasn't joking and wasn't guessing. He had control of the situation, and she had no idea how deep his knowledge went. Mason took another bite of his steak, chewing thoughtfully before speaking again. You know, Amelia, he said, I'm not here to make a scene, I just want the truth, no more games, no more lies. Amelia sat frozen, her mind a whirlwind of fear, anger and confusion. The jokes were over, and she finally understood. Amelia was shocked to realize that Mason wasn't the naive husband she had underestimated. Her face twisted with sudden rage, she slammed her hands on the table and leaned forward, her voice erupting into a furious shout. What do you want to know, Mason? She demanded. What truth am I not telling you? You just decided to put on some kind of show to humiliate me and make me look like the Amelia I tried to talk to you nicely. Remember a month ago? I offered to have an honest conversation. I wanted to work through this, but you brushed me off, denied everything, and acted like there was nothing to discuss. Now, when I've caught you red, Amelia, you still haven't had the courage to face the truth and explain yourself. Her eyes narrowed, her face flushed with indignation. I have nothing to explain. I'm not admitting to anything. Mason, what do you want from me? Mason's jaw tightened, and he leaned forward, his calm demeanor hardening. He said quietly, I understand now. You'll deny everything to the bitter end. I didn't think you could be this stubborn. Fine, Amelia. If you won't talk, then take this. Reaching into his bag, Mason pulled out. He took a crisp envelope from his bag and slid it across the table towards her. The words divorce papers were printed in bold letters across the top. Amelia froze, her breath catching as she stared at the documents. This is my last move, Mason said firmly. I gave you a chance to have an honest conversation, but you've made your choice. I'm done playing games. By the way, I'm going home now. Your things will be waiting for you on the street. Any complaints can go straight to my lawyer." Amelia, the lawyer, looked from Mason to the papers, her eyes wide with disbelief. She grabbed the envelope and held it in her hands as she stood up quickly, her chair making a loud scraping noise against the floor. "Do you think you're the smartest?" she said angrily. "Mason," she said, her voice trembling with fury and humiliation. "You've acted like a scoundrel, a complete monster." Mason met her glare with an unflinching gaze. "No, Amelia, I've acted like a man who's finally done being lied to without." Amelia turned on her heel and stormed out of the restaurant, clutching the divorce papers tightly. When she arrived home, her fury had only intensified. She fumbled for her keys as she approached the front door, but when she inserted the key into the lock it wouldn't turn. She tried again, jiggling the key, but it was useless. Then she saw them. Her belongings, suitcases, boxes, and loose items were piled neatly on the front lawn, illuminated by the soft glow of the porch light. Amelia felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead as she realized what Mason had meant. She was trembling as she walked over to the pile of belongings on the topmost suitcase. There was a note written in Mason's neat handwriting. It said, "I told you the truth would catch up with you. Good luck. My lawyer will handle the rest." Tears welled up in her eyes as she saw that the locks on the door had indeed been changed. Mason had been serious and he had prepared for this moment with meticulous planning. Amelia was standing there on the lawn, frozen, clutching the divorce papers. She was hit by the sheer scale of her situation. She'd put everything on the line and lost. The divorce trial was a circus, with Amelia trying to paint herself as a victim and Mason as a controlling abuser. She was spinning tales of manipulation and emotional cruelty, hoping to sway the court in her favor. But Mason had come prepared. When the evidence of Amelia's affair with Bruce was revealed, complete with text messages, call logs, and Bruce's wife backed up what he said, so it was obvious who was at fault. The court saw through Amelia's lies and her attempts to manipulate the narrative. They fell apart when they saw the undeniable proof. Bruce's wife was a key player. She was furious at her husband's betrayal and at Amelia's audacity. She gave key testimony and evidence that showed not only the affair but also the unethical nature of Amelia's actions. She also showed that Bruce was a former client of Amelia's. The company made things even worse. As a result of the divorce, Mason lost the house and most of his assets. And he also lost his job. His company was so upset about the scandal of an employee sleeping with a client that they fired him. On the last day of the trial, Mason felt a mix of relief and sadness. He didn't want this to be the ending, but it was the one Amelia had chosen. If she'd been honest with him that night in the restaurant, perhaps things could have ended more amicably. They could have salvaged some respect, avoided the public humiliation and parted ways with dignity. But Amelia was stubborn, she lied, and she wouldn't take accountability. There was no room for reconciliation in the end. The truth had prevailed and Amelia had paid the price. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the channel. I wish you a great mood and good luck.